My name's Greg Myers, and I teach in the Department of Linguistics and English Language at the University of Lancaster. I probably came at this from a different angle from a lot of British applied linguists. As you can probably tell from my voice, I'm not British. And in the world I was working in American higher education, two entirely separate things, linguistics and what I was working on. But let's go back. I came to it through teaching, basically. So while I was working on my PhD, I was directing a job training center in East Harlem in a Puerto Rican organization there. So that I both need to learn about EAP, I had to learn about ESP, and also had to learn some Spanish myself. So it directed me towards those kind of practical issues, even though my PhD had nothing to do with that. And I'm not a very good Spanish learner, so it did raise questions about that. Though I think it's very helpful if you're teaching people who are Spanish speakers and trying to learn Spanish yourself, it does keep you humble. The work that led into most of what I've done, my first job was at the University of Texas at Austin. Now, this is something British universities don't often understand. Almost all American universities require their students, native speakers of English, to do an English course on composition or rhetoric or something called like that, that's about basically writing for university. So things like structuring it, keeping the style consistent, thinking of an audience, coming up with ideas to write about, focusing on the logic of your argument, things like that. Almost every university requires that. Now, when I was hired at the University of Texas, they were adding another level in the third year that was more about your particular academic discipline. So I was hired to work on the one for science and technology. And that's where the practical question that my work emerged from. So I went over, some students actually introduced me to some people in the sciences, and I talked to them. And it was out of studying them, really just two people, that led to my earlier work. So it's a quite different question from EAP people, because I was talking to practicing scientists. And I was aiming it at people who, in terms of EAP, are quite far along. Monolingual British speakers, monolingual English speakers mostly, who are pretty far along with their university education at a big public university. Very much looking in Britain, when I moved to Britain, for what the equivalent of that. In America, there's a whole world of things about writing, rhetoric, academic writing, a whole world of research and conferences and journals. There's no equivalent in Britain where it's assumed if you get into a university, you can do all that. So there's no institutional background to that. So I did go to CELMUS once. I went to the Linguistics Association of Great Britain once. I went to Sociology of Science conferences, and I went to BAAL, all different things like that. But I didn't actually get involved with BAAL much until I was a plenary speaker once. And then I began to get more involved in what was going on with it. When you're looking at a linguistic question, look at the kind of interaction going on. So in writing, people often forget that there's an interaction behind it. So the work that's relevant, probably most relevant in an ELT context, is work on academic writing. And there you've got to get them to think of this is actually an interaction between you and another person that you're trying to persuade of something. And it's hard to get them to see that because they think of it as trying to do a correct paper in the form of a correct paper, like the model paper that displays their knowledge of the material. At some point, to be a successful professional, you have to get back beyond that and actually try to persuade somebody of something. That's where my contribution comes in. Then in my later work on speech, which is about interviews and is more relevant to researchers, there again, it's saying, think of the interview as a conversation, as an interaction, not just as a way of eliciting an opinion or idea that's already in their brain, that you have to get out as a package. Think of it as a conversation, and what they say to you is because you asked that question in that way at that time. So that's, most of what I've done is around that kind of issue. There's two areas. My influence on ELT is almost unintentional. But I wouldn't have the citations I have unless there was some. And it comes around in a roundabout way. So I was working on pragmatics of politeness in scientific writing. So the argument is all those things that might seem unnecessary, it might be the case, or we wish to suggest, or all that tentativeness that people from other language backgrounds find very British and very annoying. And why is all that there? I was arguing that you should consider the kinds of politeness that go on in an academic situation when you're challenging somebody else, implicitly criticizing somebody else, or claiming your own position deserves more attention like that. So it's a face-threatening act. Then some of those layers of politeness make sense. Now, the influence that has, if I look at who cited it, they were interested in hedging. Now, hedging is something taught a lot because it's something lots of people have trouble with coming to English or to British English. So that's where it had more of an impact in that kind of topic. So I was focusing on a social issue, and when it gets picked up in the form and in the bit a teacher could use it. Mm-hmm. But it didn't start being, how should you teach hedging, like that. I'm afraid for this area, the things are rather old, but I hope they're still worth looking at. There's a paper from many years ago called The Pragmatics of Politeness in Scientific Articles, and that is one that people still read, still refer to, and that gets connected to these issues about hedging and about understanding what you're doing in a scientific article. There's another one that gets referred to often that's about the narratives of science and narratives of nature. Now, you might not think that that would interest ELT professionals because it's not terribly nitty-gritty applied linguistics. But the basic point is that a popularization of science is very different in its form and the way it explains things from the original scientific article because they're doing different things. They're telling a different kind of story. So it isn't just using more accessible language. It's telling the story in a different way. And in various forms, that article gets picked up a lot in ESP. Like that. Well, I think one interesting thing that you might pick up is the way there are different ways into all applied linguistics is applied to someone, but not necessarily to ELT teachers. So some of my work is more for, say, I had workshops for qualitative market researchers because I said, I've got something, you will find it interesting. If I can persuade you it's worth your time, I'll go over this with you and you can see if it fits the problems you're having. Or, as you've seen, other people here have been talking about things that are relevant to nurses or doctors or journalists or other people like that. So it has to have an application, but not always directly a classroom application. The other thing I think I'd say is that the researcher themselves doesn't know how it's going to be applied. So I was, the kind of thing I do wouldn't be in applied linguistics at all, probably, except for John Swales, because he had taken this kind of broader social approach to how you teach article introductions. Teachers already saw article introductions were a problem, and he said, I'm not just going to tell you how to structure it. I'm going to tell you why it's that way. And for that, you need to do a bit of sociology of science and think about what they're doing. And then he gave a very nice, tight description of how an article introduction works. So that opens up for people like me doing a fairly rhetorical, high-level sort of description as still being potentially interesting. Well, I was puzzled by the interest in this narratives of science, narratives of nature. And he said, Greg, the only reason people refer to that is that it has to do with a debate about authentic materials versus materials you devised yourself to teach it. And I say, it does? And he says, yeah, it comes down pretty hard on the side of authentic materials. And I had no idea it would be used that way in that kind of argument. And indeed, I have colleagues at Lancaster who are making exactly the opposite argument. Alan Waters making exactly the opposite argument, that you shouldn't demand that everything be authentic materials like that. So probably a lot of people referring to what I'm doing are linking it to a practical issue in materials design that I had no idea about when I was writing it.